Obviously, in cases of many disputes that we hear, when there are two or more opinions, each side has good arguments. You might be convinced with the arguments of one side, you might already hold specific arguments are more convincing, and a lot of times people are not going to change their mind when they hear the other side's arguments. But at the very least, each side is honestly trying to argue based on the information given. This is true sometimes in science. Of course, scientific arguments are the more objective ones. Usually, scientists do not forgive people who mess up the data, present wrong information. But sometimes there's just not enough data to conclude one way or the other. For example, about 100 years ago, they had different opinions of how the atom is structured. And over time, there were certain experiments that made it possible to prove that at least one of the three opinions is wrong. But then there was still the dispute of the other two opinions continued until more experiments were made and new technologies were developed to be able to prove one way or another how the atom is structured. So there are cases, of course, when over time people find out the truth. But in science world, of course, it's not similar to things like politics and various social disputes. And even in science, the truth is, a lot of times the specialists don't know the true conclusion of the dispute. I'll give you a simple example. Everybody today understands that the Earth is not flat. There are very few people. There are some, but there are very few people today who think the Earth is flat. There are very easy ways to prove it. The simplest way today would be to call someone on the other side of the Earth, and when it's night there and it's day here, you ask, "Hi, what's the time by you? Is it nighttime?" Okay, so that already proves the Earth is not flat. If the Earth would be flat, it would be the same time period, whether you're in America or in Europe, let's say, or in Israel or in Asia, in China. It doesn't matter. If the Earth would be flat, one big round circle, that was the model of those who believed in flat Earth. But, the sun would be above us or below us. It's only if the Earth is round that you could say that somebody living in a different place has night when you have day. But let's say about the question of what goes around what, whether it's the sun around the Earth or the Earth around the sun. Most people, if they're asked, they'd say, okay, there used to be, the main theory was what they call geocentric, meaning that the center is the Earth and everything revolves around that. And then from the time of Copernicus on, more and more people started believing the opposite theory. And of course, today we all believe that the Earth goes around the sun. First of all, it's not exactly accurate to say the Earth goes around the sun. Rather, they go around the common center of mass. But since the sun is so much bigger, so much heavier than the Earth, so you could say more or less that the Earth goes around the sun. The truth of the matter is that after the general theory of relativity, it's not correct to say one way or another. You could put the center anywhere you want. And that's why this is an example where a lot of people who are not specialists, who are not physicists, might say that the dispute is settled, but really, you can't say it's not settled. It's just, according to the contemporary science, it's impossible to settle this dispute. There's nothing specific about one place or another where you would put the center. But whatever the case may be, of course, my examples here are only an introduction to what the main topic will be. What I want to say is that while there are some disputes, of course, where each side has a point, and sometimes maybe with more information, the dispute can be settled. A lot of cases of economics, for instance, which economic policies may work or not work, it's only time that shows did the predictions of the economists actually come true, who turned out to be right. Other disputes may be settled at some point and maybe never settled. But there are also disputes where one side simply is lying and mixing up data and showing only partial data and things like that. And that's where we have to know, and it's not always so simple to know, if one of the sides of the dispute is simply liars, that you can't rely on them. A famous example of this is a relatively recent story when there was a certain scholar and historian in England named David Irving, I think. And he was one of the Holocaust deniers. And when a certain woman in America who was a professor in college mentioned as a side note that he's a Holocaust denier, he sued her for libel. So she had to fly to England or send people, and she was taken to court. She basically said wrong things about her. What we call in Hebrew motzi shem ra. That she accused him of what's not true. He was a Hitler historian, by the way. This guy, and generally his historical works, which include a lot of books, are very much pro-Hitler and, of course, show a very different angle and different picture of what happened during World War II, during and before World War II. So the purpose of this lady, who won, by the way, the court case in England, was to show that he's no historian at all, that he's simply a liar. That it's not a question of a dispute where the majority opinion has one way of looking at history and the minority opinion has a different way of looking, but each side at least has some arguments and nobody's lying. That he's simply a liar. And among other things, when she hired a certain British historian to check on the books of this guy, of this David Irving, and this historian, when he was hired, he said, well, you can't say he's a liar. He's an important historian. He writes books. So many published works he has. But she said, no, still try. We'll pay you for doing a reasonably honest research on his books. Just go through his books. If you find that he is in fact honest and that he presents the data the way it should be and only analyzes and his conclusions are different than everybody else, fine. But if you find that he is actually misrepresenting and lying, then, we'll have a case here. And this guy, of course, this second historian, only after researching, again, it wasn't something simple. You have to go into the sources, exactly what David Irving was quoting, and to see that he's actually lying. He's a liar. So it's not two sides of the dispute or different conclusions from the same data. It's actually an incorrect data that's being used. It's lies, basically. All his historical books are based on constant lying. So why am I saying all this? Because in today's day and age, of course, very few people are capable of analyzing. You have to be a historian. You have to you have to go through a lot of data to be able to get some reasonable conclusion. A lot of times, people who are not a specialist in the topic may hear some propaganda, and a lot of times they believe one side of the propaganda, and a lot of times, at the very least, they say, okay, each side has a point. Whereas in many cases, we're dealing with pure lies on one side. So in particular, the issue of so-called the Israeli-Palestinian dispute, the other side, while Israeli books, a lot of them show all sides of the question. It's a very complex question. The side of the so-called Palestinian Authority is just presenting lies on top of lies all the time. And it's not just a second opinion, like I said. It's not a question of analyzing the information and reaching other conclusions. It's just lies. I'll give you a few simple examples of these types of lies, and you'll see what I'm talking about. One example is an article in the New York Times that Abu Manson, the head of Palestinian Authority, wrote a few years ago, where he said that in the famous vote of the UN with the partition plan that there will be a Jewish state and an Arab state. At that time, it wasn't called Palestinian states. At that time, the so-called Palestinians were just regular Arabs. They didn't consider themselves specifically attached to so-called Palestine. But at that time, it was the Jews who accepted the partition plan and the Arabs who started the war against the Jews, the war of annihilation. Guess what? He writes exactly the opposite, that the Arabs accepted the partition plan and the Jews did not accept it. So this is just an example of a pure lie. It's a historical fact. It's not a question of two opinions. Again, analyzing data is one thing, but when you're just presenting the opposite data, it's like saying that, let's say it wasn't Hitler who started the war with Poland on 1st of September of 1939, but it was Poland who attacked Hitler on the 1st of September in 1939, right? That would be an example of a pure lie. Denying Holocaust is a pure lie. And again, the same Abu Manson, his PhD basically in Russia, which he did in Soviet Union, was on denying Holocaust. And even later, when he saw that this is not particularly make him very popular in the West, very, very few people are able to get away with denying Holocaust. So he started saying something very obscure. His statement would be, oh, okay, there were some Jews killed, but the number could range anywhere. And the smaller number that he presents as a possibility is basically there's no Holocaust at all. If a few thousand Jews died, that's not Holocaust. Holocaust is when in Europe, practically a larger than half probably portion of Jews died. The general estimate is about 6 to 7 million. So So to say that, okay, a few thousand Jews died maybe, this is also denying Holocaust, basically. It's one step away from saying, okay, and those weren't annihilated specifically either. It was maybe just part of the war. Sometimes there are civilian casualties. Every war has civilian casualties. So the whole program of Hitler's Germany to annihilate all the Jews is now turned into, okay, a few Jews died, possibly by accident. So whatever the case may be, this is just another example of a pure lie. Another pure lie that the person who he appointed to be his substitute, by the way, in the area of Judea and Samaria, what the most countries today call West Bank, the area where the proposed Palestinian state is proposed to be. In that area, they haven't had elections already for many, many years, because they're afraid that if there will be an election, Hamas will come to power. So basically, Abu Mansur is ruling without any legitimacy anyway, even according to their own laws, the so-called Palestinian people, the new people that were created less than 100 years ago. So he now is very old, 89 years old, and he's a smoker, so probably he's feeling that his days are approaching to the end, and he's appointed already the new substitute of his, and said that then within 3 months they have to hold an election. Interesting, right? Now, while he's alive, they don't hold elections, but once he's dead, he doesn't care, so they have to have an election within 3 months. So this guy that he appointed, also a pretty old guy, but not as old as him. So he has been saying that the Palestinians were living there for the last 1.5 million years or something like that, right? Everybody knows that the whole idea that, some Arabs started calling themselves Palestinians, there was never such a thing until relatively recently. A lot of them don't have last names. For instance, Mohammed Def, that was annihilated recently, the one of the biggest leaders of Hamas. So his last name was actually not Def originally, was Egyptian. That's what the last name meant. He is an Egyptian. I mean, the whole definition of the so-called Palestinian refugees by the UNRWA is that anybody who lived there for 2 years, just 2 years, anybody who lived for 2 years, if they moved, for instance, from Syria to what was then called Palestine the area was called Palestine already from the times of Romans, long before the Arabs came. But the British continued calling it Palestine. So at that time, the Jews had in their passport written Palestinian. We used to call in English the Talmud of the land of Israel was called Palestinian Talmud. So everybody knew that Palestinian means Jewish. But whatever the case may be, the later definition of the Palestinian refugees, the newly created Arabs who decided that now because of the political reasons, they will be called a separate nation, a Palestinian nation. So the definition is, official definition of UNRWA is that if for 2 years, just 2 years, this family lived in the land of Israel before the war for independence, when Israel was attacked from all sides and the Arabs wanted to do another Holocaust. And some of the Arabs became refugees at that time. So these Arabs, even if they lived there for 2 years, they're already considered refugees. So that goes to prove that clearly at least a large portion of them, there are statistics trying to estimate how many actually came within what years. The majority apparently came during the time when the infrastructure was built by the British. So it was between the two world wars. Some came at the end of the period when the Turks ruled over those areas. And again, there were Jews coming, there was already some infrastructure needed, some work, and some people were immigrating from Syria and other places. So the number of Arabs who actually come from families who live there for a few hundred years is very small. But whatever the case may be, at least the very definition of so-called Palestinian by the UNRWA itself, by the agency of UN that deals with that group, is that anybody who was there for 2 years already is considered Palestinian. So you could be a Syrian who lived there for 2 years and you're already Palestinian. So that itself proves that they didn't live there for thousands of years, certainly for millions of years. And this whole idea, I mean, which nation do they attach themselves to? Plishtim? If Palestinians are Plishtim, Plishtim were the Greek nation that lived in the land of Israel for some time, and there is no reference to them already long before the Arabs came. The fact is that until recently, the Arabs admitted who they are and where they come from. And at that time, again, in their culture, it's actually considered a great advantage that they conquered all these lands, that the Arabs conquered these lands and established their religion and their people there. So at that time, everybody in the Arab world thought it was a great accomplishment that they conquered all these lands, including the land of Israel. But because the West wants to hear what they want to hear, so they present themselves now that those Arabs who, even if they would come from the times of Islam, Maybe there are some families that came from the old times, from the times that Islam conquered, but that's already 2,000 years after Jews lived on that land. So another example, most in the world of the so-called Palestinian Authority and around them deny that the Jews had a temple in Jerusalem. Again, this is not something subject to dispute. It's a pure lie. It's very clear that the Jews had a temple. There may be some disputes exactly how long the temple stood, that it stood for 420 years, the second temple, or was it a little bit more, maybe 600 years. The first temple, there are disputes about how long exactly it stood. But the fact that there were temples, and it was Jewish temples, it was never a question. And the Arabs themselves, like I said, the Arabs who would later start calling themselves Palestinians, they didn't deny until recently these types of things. This was not a controversial issue. It's not a two sides of the dispute. Did the Jews have a temple there, or did the Jews not have a temple? And there are examples like that galore. They keep saying that the Jews is a new religion, that were just regular Europeans who came and conquered the land of Israel from them and threw out the Arabs. So again, another lie. The Jews are not just European colonists. There's DNA supporting that we come from the Middle East, even the Ashkenazi Jews. Half of the Israelis are Sephardi Jews who lived near the land of Israel. And in general, the Europeans never considered us part of their nations. Judaism does include an aspect that's a religion, but it also includes an aspect of a nation. And it's not unique, by the way, in Judaism. It's true about many other cultures as well, where even the so-called Palestinians themselves, people who marry in or live with them, or even some people who came from Sudan, from Africa, who joined in, they're also considered Palestinians. So every nation is like that. It absorbs a certain number of people that don't have their DNA, let's say, but they become part of that same nation. And among Jews, in fact, we were actually a nation that had, until recently, very few people who joined us, because both in Christian countries and Muslim countries, Jews were not allowed to have anybody convert to Judaism. People who converted to Judaism would be killed, both in Muslim countries and Christian countries. So therefore, for the most of our exile, there were very few people who were added to our nation. The majority of Jews were descendants of those ancient Jews who lived in the land of Israel. But in Israel itself, there was always a Jewish community. Yes, they were constantly killed. Yes, they were constantly persecuted, and still they always came back and they always tried to live. For instance, in what the Palestinian Authority claims is a place where they would eradicate all Jewish presence if they would have the state, and that is the area of Jerusalem, of Yerushalayim, including the Western Wall, the holiest place for Judaism, right? There the Jews lived until the War of Independence, when the Jordanians purged all the Jews. It's actually the Jews who left the Arabs inside their state. The Jews always had Arabs in their state, and they had the same rights, the Arabs in the state of Israel, from the very beginning of the Declaration of Independence. But it was the Arabs who actually purged all Jews and did genocide to the Jews. And all the other countries where Jews lived, in the Middle East and in North Africa, the Jews had to run away because Arabs were killing them and destroying them and removing all their property. So if anybody should be worrying about refugee problem, it's the Jews. And yet Israel absorbed all these people. And moreover, in the Six-Day War, Israel specifically told Jordan, do not attack us and we won't attack you. And right, this was the war when Egypt was saying that they'll destroy, again, all the Jews. They wanted to do another Holocaust. And at that time, Israel was preparing mass graves. In Tel Aviv, they digged a huge mass grave because they were preparing. They didn't know how the war would go. It was another Holocaust looming in the horizon. And at the time, they begged Jordanians not to enter into that war. And the Jordanians entered. And that's when the Jews liberated Yerushalayim, Jerusalem, and other areas. And the point is that they simply restored back the Jewish quota. They didn't throw out Arabs who live in their quota. The Arab quota in Jerusalem is much bigger than the Jewish quota. It's the Arabs who throw out Jews. And between 48 and 67, the Six-Day War, throughout that time, there was not a single Jew in Jerusalem. And now the world wants to do this thing again, that there will be a Palestinian state with a capital in East Jerusalem, including our holiest spots. And the Jews won't have access again to the Western Wall, and the Jewish quota will be eradicated. Right? That's what the Western world is actually subscribing to. I'm not even talking about Hamas, who simply says from the river to the sea. But there's another thing. You might say, okay, Fatah at least is ready to have two-state solution. The truth is Fatah is also using a two-state solution only to prepare for all-out war and to destroy all of Israel. There's no real difference between Fatah and Hamas in terms of goals. So among other things, the unique situation happened that this body of UN, UNRWA, that gives status of refugees not just to the refugees themselves, but to their descendants and even partial descendants. This is something that never happened in any other case. There are millions of people who became refugees throughout 20th century and now in 21st century also. And everywhere else, UN is trying to settle them somewhere. It's only the so-called Palestinian refugees that have the status transferred from father to son and from family to their descendants. And so people who are now great-grandchildren of these so-called Palestinian refugees are still considered refugees. And there are so many of them by now that if in fact they would be allowed back into Israel, then there won't be Jewish state at all. There won't be any Jewish state, even in the area that designated by UN originally, which, like I said, Arabs did not accept and wanted to destroy. When it was a tiny territory which was completely unprotected, that's when the Arabs started the all-out war to destroy Jews in the beginning. And by the way, even before Zionism, even before the state of Israel, in the 20s already, there was a huge pogrom in Hebron. These Jews had nothing to do with the idea of establishing the Jewish state. It was just simply the Arabs came and killed everybody they could kill. Women, children, doesn't matter. So to say that it is the Jews who started, it's the Jews who was at fault, yeah, the Arabs did lose the Jewish war for independence. They called it a catastrophe. From then on, that's what they every year when it's the Independence Day for Israel, it's a catastrophe day for the Arabs. But guess what? All they need is to accept on the 1% of the lands that after World War I were conquered by England and France and other countries, right? And 1% of that land would be a small Jewish state. They got all these other states that were born around the same time period. When England and France gave independence to Syria, to Iraq, to all these countries, huge countries that were part of Ottoman Empire. Turks used to rule over this, and after World War I, the British and the French conquered it. And all they wanted is on 1% of the territory that would be a Jewish state. And 99% was given to the Arabs, and all these new states were emerged. And guess what? Even in that part of the Jewish state, first Jordan was created. That's more than half of that territory was given to the Arabs, with Jews have no presence at all. They forbid, I think that there's even a death penalty for selling any land to the Jews in the territory of Jordan. That's a relatively moderate, by the way, Muslim state. But the little Israel it's a tiny place. It's all that Israel wants is to survive. They're not trying to conquer Syria or Iraq or have a huge empire. All we want is that our ancient land, and in that land we're willing to keep the Arabs. Like I said, there are so many Arabs who live in Israel and have full rights. They're quite integrated in the society. And even in the West Bank, there were possibilities of creating some kind of Palestinian state. I was, by the way, one of the people who were for two-state solution until I realized that it simply doesn't work from the other side. That the other side wants the destruction of all Jews, and there is no real possibility for two-state solution, at least at this point. Maybe 100 years from now there would be a possibility, I don't know. But at this point in time, the two-state solution means more war and more bloodshed. And by the way, more so-called Palestinians, the Arabs that now call themselves Palestinians, more of them would be killed too, because Israel's not going to commit suicide. Just like the October 7th massacre, when over 1,000 Jews were killed, now brought so much suffering to the so-called Palestinian people. And I, by the way, feel for them. I actually am willing to look at both sides. I understand that it's very, very difficult. I wouldn't want to be a Gazan living now in Gaza. I absolutely feel for these people, especially those of them who don't really support terrorism. I don't know which percentage it is, maybe a very small percentage there that doesn't support terrorism. But a lot of them, they're brainwashed. I have a feeling for these people, actually. But I don't see any other solution. Hamas has to be destroyed, because with Hamas next to its borders, there will be more and more October 7th, like they promised. So every single person that's dying in Gaza is a fault of Hamas. It's not the fault of Israel. Israel didn't want this war. We didn't want this war at all. Nobody wanted this. Nobody was prepared for this. But they simply had no other choice, except committing suicide. That was the second choice. Either committing suicide or destroying Hamas. There's no longer a possibility to live next to Hamas. They were trying to avoid the war at all costs for all these years. But with Hamas, there's no such possibility. But even, like I said, with Fatah, with the Palestinian Authority, there's no real possibility to give them, besides the fact that most likely they will lose the election to Hamas, just like it happened in Gaza. Maybe not to Hamas, but to some other similar group. There are so many other far Islamist groups, like ISIS and Al-Qaeda and all kinds of other ones, the Muslim Brotherhood. All of them share one thing in common, that living next to them would be impossible. There are some moderate Muslim states, by the way, but nowhere near Israeli borders there's any such possibility that they would have a free election and elect anybody moderate. In fact, originally when Egypt had free elections in Obama's time, they elected Muslim Brotherhood, which is not really so far from Hamas, even though in the Western world they wanted to look at things very positively and were saying that this is not really such a terrorist organization. But pretty soon it became clear where this whole thing is headed. But thankfully there was a coup, and basically al-Sisi took the power by force over there. But if it didn't happen, then probably Hamas would be even more rearmed by the Muslim Brotherhood. This is really an offshoot of Muslim Brotherhood. So the point is that right now, for instance, in Syria, everybody knows, just started, that when Israel made Hezbollah so much weaker, once they have a peace agreement with Hezbollah, Turkey sponsoring various types of far Muslim groups is now trying to conquer most of Syria. They already conquered the north of Syria, Aleppo, the second biggest city in Syria. So this is the groups that are affiliated with ISIS and Al-Qaeda and similar monsters are conquering the groups affiliated with Iran-backed Hezbollah, Assad, and other monsters. One monster against another monster. So there's no good over there. There's nothing near Israeli borders with whom you could make alliances, with whom you could really have a reasonable. Even Jordan, the way it's holding, it's basically holding due to Israeli intelligence constantly, and that's why ISIS was never able to make it into Jordan, even at the time when it was very powerful in Obama's years, because it's Israelis who actually help stabilize more or less moderate countries near its borders. But in Palestinian Authority, there's no question that if they would have held elections before October 7th, Hamas would have won. That's why they don't hold these elections. Now it's not so clear Hamas would win, because a lot of the Palestinians are angry at Hamas because of what the suffering they're now enduring. But that's not because they feel that terrorism is wrong. At first they were cheering, they were all very happy. They're only suffering now, and that's why they feel that it was wrong step to take. So from practical point of view, they feel that the massacre of October 7th was the wrong step. Not from the fact that it's a wrong thing to do, to murder children, to rape women, to just kill as many Jews as they can. That they don't feel is bad necessarily. The majority of people in Gaza feel it's great. They were cheering about it. But the practical implications that in the end they have everything destroyed over there, and Hamas is still not releasing the hostages. Notice how Hamas, for them, it's a big advantage if more people will die. Anyway, so I went a little bit off tangent, but coming back to what I started with, and that is that there are so many lies that the so-called Palestinians are publishing, clear lies, not a question of how to estimate and to see, the other side. That I'm willing to do, but not when I'm lied to. Not when I'm told that Jews have nothing to do with the land of Israel, we have no connection to the land of Israel, when I'm told that there was never a temple in Jerusalem, when I'm told that they were there for millions of years, for 1.5 years, when I'm told that there was no Holocaust. Those are the things that just the lies. So it's not a question of two opinions and two estimations, how to read the data, how to understand the data. It's a question of pure data. Was there Holocaust or was there no Holocaust? Was there a temple in Jerusalem? Was there no temple in Jerusalem? And here the Palestinian Authority are just liars. So really you can't rely on anything they say, because until you check at least, because there's just so much lying going on. Clearly these people are completely unreliable. That's what I wanted to mention. And if you like this video, please press like.